Next Steps is a new door, and it's a new wide open door.
Next Steps to me is an opportunity for us to come alongside what God's been doing in this church for over 80 years. It's an opportunity for us to all be challenged, and a reminder too that we just get to participate in what God's already doing.
Next Steps to me means drawing closer to the Lord, stopping to think about my relationship with the Lord and what am I doing? Am I doing enough? What else can I do? People are stirred in their hearts now, and it's such a blessing to see what God is doing in our church and in our individual lives.
You've just seen some quick highlights of our early commitment event this past Thursday night. In spite of the weather, 109 families were able to be here and be a part of that time. We had a wonderful time of worship and very strategic time of prayer Thursday evening. And I want to share some encouraging results with you from our time Thursday evening. I'll remind you, as I often do, that I don't see commitment cards, I don't know what anyone gives, but our finance team just shared some results with me that I want to share with you. Probably the most exciting thing of the report from Thursday evening was this. Included in the 109 families that made commitments, there were 7 brand new givers. 7 folks, yes, who've responded to the challenge to be involved in financing the work of the Lord here. There are many of you here today that are just like these 7. Maybe you've never given to the Lord's work before, but you're considering what it would look like to go all in and be radically generous. And I know you've been praying about that, and I would encourage you, you received a commitment card again as you came in this morning. The gift chart is on the back of that. I would encourage you again to look over that gift chart and pray over that. And my encouragement to all of us is to look at the spot where we probably feel comfortable and then pray above that. Ask the Lord if there's something more that He would have us to do, some greater stretch of faith. Let me share the results of some actual families from Thursday night. I don't know the names of these families. I just know the decisions they made. One family multiplied their giving 6 times, going from $600 over the last 2 years to $3,600 over the next 2 years in Next Steps. Another family is multiplying their giving 2.5 times, going from $12,000 the past 2 years to $29,000 in the next 2 years for Next Steps. Another family multiplying their giving 2.5 times, going from $24,000 the past 2 years to $60,000 for the next 2 years in Next Steps. And one more, another family is multiplying their giving over 3 times, going from $29,000 over the last 2 years to $90,000 in the next 2 years for Next Steps. God has grown these families to take huge steps in their generosity, and I think we need to celebrate that as well. And there are many more of us in this room that God is going to lead to make some pretty radical increases in our commitments. Some of you I know, because we've had conversations, not about the amount, but you've been shocked at the number that you felt God led you to put down. And for you, that represents a great step of faith. Others of you maybe have an idea of the number that God is going to lay on your heart, but that could change radically even this last week. We're seeing God do some new and powerful work in hearts and minds in our body. And it could be even in this last week, the Lord's going to do something unexpected and something powerful. And I would say to you, if you're still praying and still contemplating, you need to be open to that. And I would ask you, would you be open to that God might do something in your heart this week? You know, increasing our giving over the next 2 years from 10 million to 17 million is certainly not insurmountable. I'm sure when you first saw the number, maybe it took your breath away. You thought, how's it going to happen? Well, we're already a generous church. We already give about $10 million every 2 years. So we're already a generous church and generous people. What we're doing is asking the Lord to help us increase our generosity, but then also to increase the number of people in our church who give generously to support our ministries. Some of you, like these 7 new ones Thursday night. Now, some of you already give quite generously, even extravagantly, well over the tithe. And as you pray and seek the Lord, He may tell you, you're fine where you are. You don't need to make any change. If you still feel some compulsion that you want to do something, you could make a one-time gift to help us move forward. But you need to listen to the Lord and hear what He has to say. Some of you will do as others have done this past Thursday. You'll double or triple or maybe give 10 times what you've given in the past. I don't know. That's between you and the Lord. Many of you who have never given before will go all in. You'll say, you know what, I need to be a part of this. I need to obey the Lord, and I want to join what He's doing here. But let me remind you, our primary focus is it's not a building, it's not a project, it's not a dollar amount, it's even not more ministry dollars. Our primary focus from day one has been the discipleship of every believer. We want the Lord to focus on our attitudes, on our heart, and push all of us into a lifestyle of generous giving and sacrifice. We're close to wrapping up our Next Steps initiative. As you know, next week is Commitment Sunday. I'm really looking forward to seeing what God has done in hearts and lives over the last several weeks. Now, I don't know how this happened exactly, but somehow Commitment Sunday has landed on Time Change Sunday. And it's the bad one, okay? It's the bad one. You're going to lose an hour of sleep on Saturday night. And I'll admit I'm a bit concerned about some of you remembering to change your clocks and be here on time for the service Sunday morning. So I've prayed about that, and I've got a plan. There are no worries if you oversleep Sunday morning. If you're not here by 9:30, I'll be sending Pastor Jason over to your house to pick up your commitment card. Now, if you're a guest, you're laughing because some of you have guns. I know why you're laughing. If you're a guest this morning, we're in a generosity initiative where we're challenging every member, everyone who's connected to our church to seek the Lord about the next steps in generosity. And all of the information, there are probably still guidebooks on the end of the row. If you're going to be with us for the next several weeks, you can certainly pick one of those up. All the information about our Next Steps initiative is on our website. There are renderings in our lobbies, upper and lower lobbies, that you can go by and look at and see what we're doing as far as the renovation part of our initiative. And I want to pause here, thinking about the renovation. I want to pause here and tell you something that kind of bothered me initially, bothered my mission heart. When you hear me say I was bothered, don't hear me say I'm not in 100% support of what we're doing. I've already told you our commitment and that we're in full support. But many of you who've been here for years may remember that for many years I led our mission emphasis here at Geyer Springs, especially our international emphasis. And when you travel to the kind of places that I have traveled, many third world countries, and you see the poverty and you see what a few dollars can do, it's hard to think about spending big dollars. You always equate everything to how many shelters could we build, how many families could we cover, how many families could we feed. And when the initial cost of renovation came in, which I fully feel like we need to do and proceed on, at 8.5, and then our staff reduced it to $7 million, it was still a struggle for me to think about spending $7 million. But here's what I feel like the Lord really made clear to me just this last week. Somewhere prior to 10 years ago, it could have been 13, 14, 15, I don't remember the exact date, but more than 10 years ago, we as a church, and we've been working hard to do this, we surpassed $1 million a year in mission giving. That was with our cooperative program, with all of our international projects and partners. We surpassed $1 million a year. And I'm just going to say 10 years ago just to make sure I don't get off course too much here. For the next, let's say 15 years, this remodel should hold quite a while. It's been 25 years since we renovated this worship center, but let's say it's just going to last another 15 years. We'll give at least $1 million a year for the next 15 years. In fact, if you followed the numbers of our Next Steps initiative, we want to move that to $1.5 million a year as soon as we can. And so from 10 years ago and the next 15 years, over that 25-year span, we're going to give at least $25 million to missions. Now, it's unfortunate that the hit on renovating the worship center all comes at one time. If you took that $7 million and spread it out over 25 years, it's less than $300,000 a year. So while I looked at that big number and thought, man, that's really tough to swallow considering we're only doing $1 million to $1.5 million a year for missions, when you spread it out, it's really not that significant. We just have to do it all at once. We can't piecemeal this thing over the next 10 years. So I just want to share that from my heart because most of you know my commitment to missions, and I want to be sure that you're clear that we're still committed, very committed to the work of missions. Well, last week we looked in Scripture, we looked at biblical teaching on the tithe, we looked at the biblical admonitions of every Christ follower to be generous. All of us who make up the body of Christ here at Geyer Springs are at different stages of spiritual growth and discipleship. So we're all at different places in our giving and in our lifestyle of generosity. Let me ask you to turn in your guidebook to page 50 and 51 just for a moment. And let's talk about how we grow in our generosity. On 50 and 51, you see, we call this the pathway to generosity. They're the 5 steps in a life of generosity. And it starts, as it did for some people Thursday night, it starts in being an initial giver. An initial giver may not just jump into the tithe right off the top, but they've come to the point, they've heard God's word, they respond to the teaching on giving, and they say, we need to be involved. We need to be a part of that. We need to give and trust the Lord to use what we give and use the leadership in the church to use that gift wisely, to be good stewards of that gift. Now, initial giver, it may just be a one-time gift. It may not be a commitment. It may be very occasional. From the step of being an initial giver, you move to the point of being a consistent giver. That's a person who commits to giving on a regular basis. It's almost like it's in their budget. Just like there are other things that they pay for in good seasons and tough seasons, it's in their budget. They make a commitment. We're going to consistently give. Many of those people do that through online giving. About 30% of our consistent givers give through online. From there, the next step is to intentional giving. Now, what's intentional giving? Well, we look at our giving to the Lord and compare it to our other spending. And we evaluate it that way. We consider a percentage or amount that we want to give. We look at our budget, and we consider how our giving affects our view of God and His kingdom and how it reflects that. Surrendered giver is a person who is surrendered to honor God with 100% of their resources. I understand it's not just about the 10% or 15% that they give. They understand that everything they have belongs to the Lord, and so their giving governs their spending and saving rather than the other way around. See, a lot of times we'll let what we spend and how much we want to save determine how much we'll give. A surrendered giver lets their giving determine what they'll spend and what they'll save. And then, of course, the lifetime giver is a person who thinks about the long-term effects of their generosity. And it so affects them that when they buy a home or when they purchase a car, they consider, when they save, they consider how much they're giving before how much they're spending or saving. And a lot of lifetime givers have a lifetime goal. They have decided at some point in their life, hey, we want to be sure that we give this much money to the work of the Lord. And that affects not only their income, it affects their financial planning, it affects their wills and their trust. All of that is affected. So what I want you to see is these 5 steps are signposts along the way. They indicate where you are in your discipleship of giving. And I want you to see this as well. It's not really a dollar amount. It's a determined action. Hey, we want to be this type of giver. We want to live in this type of way. And so my admonition to you would be to spend some time looking through that to determine where you are, and then just ask the Lord, do you have it for us as a family, for me as an individual? Do you have it for us to move forward or move up a step or two in the giving? I mentioned last week that our giving has to be motivated by a heart of gratitude. Gratitude for what? Well, first of all, gratitude that Jesus has given everything, even his very life to provide our salvation. And beyond that, if that was all that we ever received from the Lord, it would be enough. But beyond that, God has given us blessing after blessing in this life. And so I can't emphasize enough giving out of a heart of gratitude. I'm not asking you, this campaign is not about asking you to give to something. It's not about asking you to give to the church or give to this project. That's not what we want from you as a church. What we want is for you to receive from the Lord, for you to learn to give generously, to sow generously from the heart so that you receive abundant blessing from the Lord in obedience. Now, as I mentioned, next week's Commitment Sunday, you have a card. You received one last week. You got another card this morning. That's for you to take, to pray. You don't have to have this filled out when you come next week. There will be time to do that. But I want to just point out very quickly on this commitment card, if you haven't looked at one yet, the top line is for you to think about, okay, what have we given to the Lord in the past? In the past year, what has our commitment been? And then, how much do we want to expand our generosity? How much more do we want to give? And then you multiply that by 2 years, and that pretty well gives you your total commitment to the Next Step Generosity Initiative. I do want to point out there is a box there that says stored resources. As we pledge to give over the next 2 years, we're pledging to give based on God's provision for us. He's going to provide, and so we want to honor him by giving back to him. Stored resources is giving to the Lord based on how he's already blessed. That could be something in retirement account. That could be a car. That could be a boat. That could be a house. That could be money you have in savings. Maybe you've been saving for a new car, and you say, the Lord will make this car run for another year or two. That's what stored resources are. It's the opportunity to kind of give a boost to the Next Steps Generosity Initiative by providing stored resources in addition to what you're committing to give over the next several years. And by the way, I didn't know this till this morning, but there is also a kids commitment card. If you have a child in kindergarten through 5th grade, you probably receive one of these in the mail, but we're trying to teach our kids what it means to be generous as well and get them thinking about, are there some chores I could do in order to give to the work of the Lord? Are there other things I can do to be able to do that? And these are available. They came in the mail. If you have a student, they're also available in the kids ministry area. All right, let me make sure you're not uptight about next week. What's going to happen next week is we're going to have, as we do every Sunday, a service of worship and a time of looking into the Word. And at the conclusion of the service, the last few moments of the service, we will ask everyone to come and to bring their commitments and lay them here on the altar. You can see, by the way, the card is folded. No one will be able to view your commitment. That is definitely between you and the Lord. All right, let me invite your attention this morning to Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13. It's the 4th book in the Old Testament. You should be able to find that pretty quickly. The messages in our Next Step series, what we've covered so far the last 3 weeks were a step of faith and a step of stewardship and a step of obedience. And I've titled the message this week, A Step Back. And if you want a more detailed title for your notes, it is A Step Back from Faith. All of us have had moments in our lives, if you've walked with the Lord very long at all, we've had moments in our lives where we were walking with the Lord and then we took our eyes off of him. And when we take our eyes off the Lord, that is prime opportunity for fear to grip our hearts and cause us to take a step back. And as we're considering steps of faith individually and corporately, we want to be very careful that fear does not cause us to shrink back, that fear doesn't cause us to pause or to turn back. Numbers 13 and 14, quite a long passage this morning, but I hope you'll follow along with me. And I'll skip around a little bit, but I'll let you know when that's coming. Numbers 13. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them." So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the people of Israel. And then you see in verses 3 through 17, it lists all the names of the 12 spies. Drop down to verse 17. Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and he said to them, "Go into the Negev and go up into the hill country and see what the land is, whether the people dwell in it are strong or weak, whether they are few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, whether the cities they dwell are camps or strongholds, and whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage, bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. Then 21 through 24 describes the route they took as they surveyed the land. Verse 25, at the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. They came to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation, the people of Israel, in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. They had brought back a cluster of grapes so large, 2 men had to carry it with poles. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb, that's what the other spies reported, verse 30, but Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had gone and spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out, it is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And then in chapter 14, all the congregation raised a loud cry. The people wept that night. All the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy it out, it is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. In other words, we will devour them. They will not devour us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Then all the congregation said to stone them with stones, but the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. In verses 13 and 19, you have Moses pleading with the Lord to forgive the people and not destroy them. Verse 20, then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, none of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. None of those who despise me shall see it, but my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land into which he went, and his descendants shall possess it. Now, since the Amalekites and the Canaanites dwell in the valleys, turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way to the Red Sea. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. Say to them, as long as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and all of your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land which I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness. Your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have surely spoken. Surely this I will do to this wicked generation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. And the men whom Moses sent out to spy the land, who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him by bringing a bad report about the land, the men who brought up a bad report of the land died by plague before the Lord. Of those men who went to spy out the land, only Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh remained alive. If you're taking notes this morning, page 28 in your Next Steps guidebook is a good place for that. I'm going to give you just 3 simple statements this morning. The text pretty well preaches itself, but being a preacher, I can't stop there, so I'm going to do what my kids call dadsplaining. Let's be sure we're clear about 3 things, 3 backward steps that caused millions of Israelites to miss the blessing of entering the promised land. Step number 1, they forgot God's faithfulness. They forgot God's faithfulness. Think about all they have seen God do up to this point, if you know the story of the Exodus. First of all, he very miraculously freed them from bondage in Egypt. They saw those 10 plagues. They witnessed his power in the 10 plagues that came against the Egyptians. After they left Egypt, they watched him part the Red Sea for them to walk through on dry ground, and then that same Red Sea covered over and destroyed the Egyptian army. In the wilderness, God gave them manna. They complained. He added quail. They got water from a rock. They saw all these things. When the Amalekite army came out against them, God enabled Israel to defeat that Amalekite army. So over and over and over again, they've seen the faithfulness of God. They know that he keeps his promises in their behalf of protection and provision, but now they're at a crisis point. Their faith is about to be tested. If you're ever at a point where your faith is about to be tested, the most important word for you is this word: remember. You see, when you recall the faithfulness of God in the past, that is a lifeline to get you through your current storm. It's important for us to remember what God has done, but honestly, we're not very good at remembering, are we? We don't think about, when we're at a crisis point, we don't turn our thoughts to the Lord and all he's done. When a crisis of faith comes, it seems that our minds and our hearts can't recollect the faithfulness of God in our lives. If you've ever come to me during a storm in your life, you know that one of the first questions I will ask you is, do you keep a journal? And the reason I ask that is I've discovered in my own life, if I'm not faithful to write down what I see God doing and how I see God moving, I forget. And when you come to a storm, you need to remember what God has done, because when you doubt God's faithfulness in the past, then you doubt his ability to keep his promises in the future. And that's exactly what happened in their case. All those things God had done, all those wonders, all those miracles, all those works he had done in their behalf, they forgot about. When you remember the faithfulness of God, it enables you to take big steps of faith, knowing that God always keeps his promises. So what happens when you doubt the faithfulness of God? What happens when you're not sure that he can keep his promises? Look what they did. Point number 2 this morning. They relied on their own wisdom. Because they forgot that God is faithful, because they forgot that God had made a promise all the way back to Abraham that they'd heard through all the years that promise had been handed down, because they forgot all that, they decided when it came time to go into the land that they would rely on their own wisdom. I titled this message, A Step Back. A great subtitle would be A Step of Self-Reliance. When you make your steps based on self-reliance on what you can do, you are always going to fail. Anytime we rely on our own wisdom, our own ability, our own strength, we're going to take a huge step back from faith. Now, you don't know this from reading the Numbers account. You have to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 1. The idea of sending spies to check out the land seemed like a good and reasonable idea. But it was actually indicative of a festering seed of doubt. You see, back in Deuteronomy 1, Moses records the fact that God told the people to go in and take possession of the land. And after God told them to go in and take possession of the land, the people came back and said, well, how about if we send spies first? Now, God allowed that, but it clearly wasn't necessary. Did God need someone to go out and scout or spy out the land? He already knew everything that was in the land. He knew everything about it. He knew about the people in it. He had a clearly orchestrated plan to enable his people to possess the land. just as he has a clearly orchestrated plan for me and for you. Just as he knows our path and every step of our journey. God told them to go and possess the land, and they said, well, how about we send some spies? How about we send some scouts in first to check it out? Well, that doesn't seem like a big issue. You might even say, well, what's the problem with scouting out the land? What scouting out the land was going to lead to was viewing the challenge from a human perspective instead of a supernatural perspective. They were scouting the land through human eyes, trying to figure out what they could humanly do to take possession of this promised land that God had given them. Scouting out the land and applying human wisdom meant that they were not going to rely on the wisdom of God and not follow the command of God. Look down in chapter 13, verses 18 and 19. You see that they're going to evaluate the strength of the people in the land, how numerous they might be, whether or not they live in fortified cities, and whether the land is rich and good. Listen, God already knew all the answers to those questions. He'd already told them to go in and to take the land. So it appears what they're doing is they're questioning the wisdom and the ability of God. If they go in and see the people are strong and they're numerous and they're giants and live in fortified cities, then they're going to ask the question, well, can God defeat those strong people and help us defeat those in walled cities? In verses 28 and 29 of chapter 13, the spies come back, and listen, their report is very factual. It is a rich land. Yes, the people in the land are strong. They do live in walled cities, and there are even giants in the land. Everything in their report was completely true, but they left God out. They left God out. Unlike Caleb, those other 10 spies focused on the obstacles instead of the opportunity. Caleb didn't deny their account. He just said, they've come to the wrong conclusion. Surely we can. God has given us this land. We need to stop looking at it from a human perspective. God has said to go in and possess the land, so surely we can. Their conclusion is wrong. Those people are not going to defeat us. We're not going to be beat down or beat back. We can. But because they forgot God's faithfulness, because they sought out human wisdom instead of the wisdom of God, the final step backward was devastating. Number 3, they refused to obey. God had told them what they were to do, but they refused to obey. And what do you see in chapter 14? The negative talk spreads rapidly throughout the entire congregation. The bad report given bred fear. And then the people engage in utter rebellion, not just against Moses and Aaron. Their utter rebellion was not against those human leaders. Their rebellion was against God himself. And so they shrank back in fear because they were trusting in their own abilities instead of the ability of God. And what's the result? The 10 spies were struck down. Everyone 20 years and under were doomed to wander in the wilderness until they died. 40 years of wilderness wandering. And those who are above the age of 20 would never experience the blessing of inheriting the land that God had reserved for them. Isn't that a great story? So we're done, right? We'll see if we can finish on a positive note. Let's contrast Caleb with the other 10 spies and the faithless people. Chapter 14 and verse 24, we see that Caleb is spared from the judgment that falls on the people, and God declares that Caleb has a different spirit. In fact, 6 times in 30 verses, it's mentioned that Caleb had a different spirit. What is that? What kind of spirit did Caleb have? Well, Caleb had a passion for God, and he was determined to follow God with his whole heart. It didn't matter what men said. It didn't matter what the obstacles looked like. He was going to follow God with his whole heart, and that's what you see in the life of Caleb. He walked with God all of his life, and he finished well. Over in Joshua chapter 14, the wilderness wandering is over. Joshua is now leading. The people are going in to to possess the land. And there in Joshua 14, they're talking about the division of the land among the 12 tribes. And Caleb is there. And he says to Joshua in the presence of the assembly there, he reminds Joshua, he says, I was 40 years old when Moses sent me to spy out the land, and I brought word back as it was in my heart. But my brothers, the other spies, they caused the people to melt with fear. And Caleb says, yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Caleb reminds Joshua, Moses told me on that day that the land where my foot had trod, that land would be given to me as an inheritance. And listen to this. It's Caleb talking. And now behold, I am this day 85 years old. I'm as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. I have the same strength now that I had then. I have the strength for war, for going and coming. So give me this hill country. What hill country? The hill country where the giants dwell. He wasn't looking for a little retirement parcel, a little villa on the Dead Sea. He said, give me the giants. Give me the hill country. I'm 85 years old and I can still take them. And God will be with me and I will drive them out just as the Lord said. Verse 13, Joshua chapter 14. Joshua blessed him. He gave Hebron to Caleb. Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he fully followed the Lord God of Israel with his whole heart. Who you want to be? You know, nobody remembers the name of the 10 spies because their actions were shameful. But we know Joshua, we know Caleb. They followed the Lord wholeheartedly. They were able to remember God's faithfulness. If God has been faithful in the past, he will continue to be faithful. His promises don't just disintegrate, they don't dissolve, they don't go away. And if you're focused on the faithfulness of God, you don't worry about relying on human wisdom. That's always going to fail you. If you do rely on human wisdom, you look at it from a human perspective, you're not likely to obey the Lord. His perspective is not like ours. His thoughts are not like our thoughts. His ways are not like our ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's thoughts higher than our thoughts. We need to focus on what God says. We need to take the steps he calls us to take. We can't evaluate them from our perspective. And this is not just about taking a step of faith in the matter of generosity. This is about your life as a disciple, as a follower of Christ, whatever he calls you to, whether it's a generous step of faith, whether it's a step of sharing your faith with your neighbor, whether it's a change in your job because he has something else for you, whatever the step is, don't look at it with human wisdom. Think about and remember the faithfulness of God and say, I'm going to follow him wholeheartedly. If God calls me to do this, I will do it. And I will follow him all of my life. I'm not going to shrink back in fear. I'm not going to take a step backwards in faith. I'm certainly not going to refuse to obey the Lord God.